The trench began in the shadow of his cabin and ended 90 feet away at the mossy bank of the spring-fed creek. It was late October in the Driftless Region of Iowa, 1879, and the air already had the sharp, brittle edge of the winter to come. Radek Hrubý did not work with the frantic haste of a man racing the frost. He worked with the steady, rhythmic measure of a man laying tiles, which is exactly what he was doing. Beside the neat 4-foot-deep channel lay a long spine of reddish, salt-glazed clay pipes, each 2 feet long, their bell and spigot ends waiting to be joined. From the door of his smithy, Wendell Cosgrave watched. The blacksmith was a man whose world was defined by the known properties of iron and fire. He understood stress, thermal shock, and fracture. He saw a Czech farmer, barely a year in the country, digging a ditch that made no sense. Every other settler was chinking, daubing, and banking their cabins, sealing every conceivable crack against the coming cold. Radek Hrubý, meanwhile, was methodically engineering a direct, hollow passage from the dampest part of his property into the very heart of his home. It was worse than foolish. It was an invitation to disaster. The whole settlement thought it. Cosgrave was just the one who said it aloud. He saw a fool digging his family's winter grave, one pipe length at a time. What no one understood was that Radek wasn't letting the cold in. He was building it a dedicated road, so it would stop invading through every other path. If you stay with me, I promise you will learn a fundamental principle of thermodynamics that most home builders today still get wrong. It's a lesson about pressure, air, and how the most comfortable home is not the one that holds its breath the tightest. Let me know in the comments what you think the biggest mistake people make when trying to heat a home is. And if you value this kind of practical historical wisdom, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel. Radek Hrubý was not a farmer, though he now owned a farmer's acreage. He was not a frontiersman, though he lived on the edge of settled land. His hands were not shaped by the axe handle or the plow's grip. His hands knew the slick, yielding body of wet clay, the heft of a shaping paddle, the dry, radiating heat of a kiln door. His memory was a catalog of textures and temperatures, the grit of grog in the clay mix, the cool smoothness of a finished pipe on the drying rack, the precise cherry-red glow of a kiln at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the acrid smell of the salt vaporizing to form a glassy, waterproof glaze. He was a tile maker, from a region of Bohemia where water management was an art stretching back centuries. He had spent 20 years making subgrade drainage and sewer pipes. He didn't just know clay. He knew clay buried in the earth. He knew how to fire a pipe so its body became vitrified, dense as stone, and impervious to the slow, crushing power of water and frost. His father, and his father before him, had taught him that a pipe laid below the frost line was not in a world of winter, but in the steady, cool cellar of the earth itself. It was a world of stability. That knowledge felt useless during his first Iowa winter. The cabin he'd built was tight, made of good oak logs, well chinked with mud and moss. He had bought the best cast-iron stove he could afford in Dubuque. And yet, the cold laid siege to them. His wife, Annetta, and their 2 young children, Jakub and Eliska, lived in a shrinking circle of warmth around the stove. The problem wasn't the stove's heat, it was its hunger. The fire roared, devouring seasoned oak. But it also devoured the air in the small cabin. That first winter was a litany of small miseries that accumulated into a constant, draining hardship. The stove drew so hard that a cold, invisible river flowed constantly across the floor, chilling their feet and ankles. A perpetual, low whistle came from beneath the door, a sound that became the background music of their lives. When they sat at the small wooden table to eat, their fingertips would go numb, holding their forks. Annetta was constantly reheating coffee on the stovetop, less for drinking and more for warming her hands. The backs of the wooden chairs were so cold they felt damp, and leaning back was a shock to the system. Eliska developed a persistent dry cough. They slept in their coats, huddled under every blanket they owned, and still woke up stiff and cold. Radek, a man of practical science, felt like he was fighting a ghost. He would feed the fire, and the ghost would answer by pulling more cold through the walls. The more he fought, the stronger his enemy became. The conventional wisdom of the frontier was clear. A house leaks heat, so you must seal the leaks. Every settler in the valley subscribed to this logic. They spent their autumns in a frantic ritual of sealing. They re-chinked the logs, stuffed rags around the window frames, and banked sod against the foundation. It was a battle of attrition against the thousands of tiny cracks that riddled any log structure. But they were sealing the wrong holes because they misunderstood the nature of their enemy. The true problem wasn't the heat getting out. It was the cold getting in. And it wasn't just leaking. It was being actively inhaled. A fire is an act of consumption. To burn a single cord of dry oak, a stove requires over 200,000 cubic feet of air. In a typical 16 by 20 foot cabin with an 8-foot ceiling, the entire volume of air in the room was roughly 2,500 cubic feet. This meant that over the course of a few cold days, the stove would consume the cabin's entire atmosphere more than 80 times over. That air had to come from somewhere. With every log that burned, the stove acted as a powerful exhaust fan, pulling air from the room and sending it up the chimney. This created a state of negative pressure inside the cabin. The house became a gentle vacuum. Nature, which abhors a vacuum, immediately sought to equalize the pressure. It pushed air in from the outside, through any and every available opening. The carefully sealed cracks around the windows became screaming jets of frigid air. The gap under the door became a miniature blizzard. The tiny imperfections in the chinking became conduits for the killing cold. The settlers were trying to plug 1,000 tiny holes while ignoring the massive pump they stoked 3 times a day in the center of their homes. This created a vicious cycle. The colder the drafts, the more wood they burned. The more wood they burned, the harder the stove drew. The harder it drew, the more powerful the vacuum became, and the more frigid air it sucked in from outside. They were heating the cabin with one hand and freezing it with the other. Wendell Cosgrave's smithy was the most extreme example of this principle. His massive forge, burning charcoal at welding temperatures, could suck the heavy double doors of the smithy shut with an audible groan. He knew the power of a fire's breath. He, like everyone else, simply accepted it as a non-negotiable cost of warmth. To have a fire, you must endure a draft. It was a law of physics, as immutable as the fact that hot iron glows. They were all living inside a giant, leaky bellows, and the fire itself was pulling the handle. Radek Hrubý looked at this law of nature and saw only a poorly designed system. The problem wasn't the fire, it was what the fire was breathing. The work began in September. Radek didn't fell trees or mix daub. He went to the clay deposits by the creek, the same ones the local pottery used. He spent a week testing the clay, feeling its plasticity, checking its sand content, firing small test bricks in a makeshift kiln. Once he was satisfied, he built a proper kiln, a small, efficient updraft design he could build from memory. He spent the next 3 weeks making the pipes. He turned them on a simple wooden mold, let them dry to a leather-hard state in the sun, and then fired them, one batch at a time, to a temperature that turned the raw clay into dense, waterproof ceramic. As the trench deepened, the talk in the settlement grew. It was a curiosity at first, then a source of mild amusement. By the time he started laying the finished pipes, it had become a subject of serious doubt, voiced most authoritatively by Wendell Cosgrave. The blacksmith would stop by on his way home, stand at the edge of the trench with his arms crossed over his massive chest, and offer his professional opinion. "That clay's gonna crack, Radek," he said one afternoon, his voice full of confident pity. "Frost line's 4 feet deep in these parts. I've seen it heave granite boulders. Your little pipes won't last till the new year." Radek, down in the trench, looked up. "The frost will not reach it," he said, his English careful and precise. He laid a straight edge across 2 sections of pipe, checking the level, then went back to his work. A week later, Cosgrave returned. Radek was now joining the pipes. "You're just building a tunnel for the damp," the blacksmith declared. "That creek air is wet. You'll have frost on your stovepipe and mildew on your walls. You'll be breathing swamp fog all winter. Mark my words." Radek's response was, as always, minimal. "The earth will warm it," he said, not looking up. The signature moment of the construction wasn't the digging or the firing of the pipes, but the sealing of the joints. This was the detail that separated a simple conduit from a sophisticated system. Radek and his son, 10-year-old Jakub, worked together. Radek heated pine pitch in an iron pot over a small fire until it was liquid and fragrant. Then he stirred in sand, creating a thick, gritty mastic. While he painted the hot mixture onto the spigot end of one pipe, Jakub would hold the bell end of the next one steady. They would fit the pipes together, and Radek would use a wooden paddle to force the hot pitch mixture deep into the joint, creating a permanent, waterproof, and slightly flexible seal. The low autumn sun cast long shadows across the yard. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the scrape of Radek's paddle, and the sharp, clean scent of hot pine. It was a lesson, passed from father to son without many words. It was about patience, about precision, about knowing that the integrity of a 90-foot system depended on the quality of each 2-foot connection. When all 90 feet of pipe were laid and sealed, sloping gently upward from the creek to the cabin, the final connection was made. Radek cut a neat circular hole in the floorboards directly behind the stove. He had designed his stove placement for this from the beginning. The final pipe section came up through the floor. He attached it to a small, custom-made steel box that bolted to the stove's air intake vent. He had commissioned the box from Cosgrave himself a month earlier, describing it as a draft regulator. The blacksmith had fabricated it perfectly, grumbling about the strange design but taking Radek's money. Now its true purpose was revealed. It was the lung. The last act was to bury the evidence. Radek and Jakub spent 2 days carefully backfilling the trench, tamping the earth down in layers. When they were finished, the only visible signs of the massive undertaking were a small, grated opening in the creek bank, shielded by a stone overhang, and a short section of red clay pipe rising from the floor to meet the back of the stove. To a visitor, it looked like a minor, peculiar modification. To Radek, it was the transformation of his house from a leaking sieve into a sealed, breathing vessel. To understand the genius of Radek's clay pipe, you first have to understand the brutal physics of a conventional cabin in an Iowa winter. The cabin is a closed system, a box. The stove inside is an engine that turns wood and air into heat. The problem is where it gets its air. By drawing its combustion air from inside the heated room, the stove becomes a powerful pump, constantly working against the integrity of the home. Let's put numbers to it. The air outside is a bone-chilling -25 degrees Fahrenheit. This air is dense and carries a certain amount of thermal energy, or BTUS. When this frigid air is sucked into the cabin through a crack in the wall, it immediately begins to steal heat from everything it touches: the floor, the furniture, the people. The stove must then burn more wood, not just to heat the room, but to first heat this incoming Arctic air up to a temperature where it can even combust efficiently. It's a thermodynamic tax, and the rates are punishingly high. This is the state of negative pressure. The house has lower air pressure inside than outside, and the result is a constant, uncontrolled infiltration of cold air. You can add more chinking, but the vacuum will just pull harder on the remaining cracks. You can stuff the chimney with a damper, but then the fire smolders, producing smoke and creosote instead of heat. You are always losing. Radek's system fundamentally changed the equation. He wasn't just creating a pipe, he was tapping into a massive passive heat exchanger, the Earth itself. Below the frost line, typically 3 to 4 feet deep in that part of Iowa, the ground maintains a remarkably stable temperature year-round. It doesn't freeze. It stays somewhere between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit, warmed by the planet's geothermal energy. Now follow the journey of a single molecule of air. It enters the system at the creek bank at a frigid minus 25 degrees. It begins its 90-foot journey through the vitrified clay pipe, which is buried 4 feet deep in 45-degree soil. For the entire length of that journey, the pipe is in thermal contact with the warmer earth. Heat naturally flows from the warmer soil to the colder air inside the pipe. The clay itself, being a good conductor, facilitates this transfer. By the time that molecule of air reaches the stove, it is no longer minus 25 degrees. It has been tempered, pre-warmed to approximately 40 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a staggering 65-degree increase in temperature achieved passively with no fuel burned. This had two revolutionary effects. First, the stove was now being fed stable, 40-degree air. It no longer had to waste energy heating its own intake air from a deep freeze state. This meant it could burn the wood far more efficiently, extracting more BTUs from every single log. The fire was hotter, cleaner, and required less fuel. Second, and more importantly, the fire was no longer stealing its air from inside the cabin. The entire 200,000 cubic feet of air it needed to burn a cord of wood was now supplied directly from the outside. The negative pressure inside the cabin was eliminated because there was no longer a vacuum. The uncontrolled infiltration of cold air simply stopped. The whistle under the door went silent. The icy jets of air from the window frames ceased. The cabin was no longer fighting itself. It became a calm, stable environment, holding on to the heat the stove produced. Instead of constantly having it stolen by drafts, the stove itself created. Radek hadn't just plugged the leaks. He had removed the very force that made them leak in the first place. That winter, the sky turned the color of iron and stayed that way. A dome of Arctic high pressure settled over the upper Mississippi Valley, and for 11 days, the bottom fell out of the thermometer. There was no wind, no snow, just a silent, heavy, and profound cold that seemed to press down from space itself. The official temperature in Dubuque held at minus 32 degrees Fahrenheit. In the hollows and valleys of the Driftless, it was colder still. The sound of axes echoed constantly across the frozen landscape as men burned through their wood piles at an alarming rate. Smoke poured from chimneys, but it gave little comfort. Inside the Cosgrave cabin, life had contracted into a miserable circle around their big cast-iron stove. Wendell's wife, Mary, had hung blankets over the doorways to the small sleeping rooms, but they did little to stop the chill. The water bucket by the door, just 10 feet from the roaring fire, was frozen solid by morning. They ate with their coats and hats on, their breath pluming in the air at the far end of the room. Every time Wendell opened the stove to heave in another log, a vortex of air would rush past him, kicking up dust and making the flames in the oil lamp gutter violently. It was a hungry, desperate fire in a hungry, desperate house. At the Hrubý cabin there was quiet. The cold outside was just as absolute, the landscape just as frozen, but inside, the laws of physics had been rewritten. Annetta worked at the table in the middle of the room, her sleeves rolled up as she mended one of Jakub's shirts. The air was so still that the thread hung perfectly straight. On the floor, Eliska and Jakub played a game with carved wooden animals, their laughter small and clear in the warm air. There were no drafts. The windows were clear of the thick frost that coated every other pane of glass in the valley. Radek kept a thermometer. It was -32 outside. Inside, it was a steady 68 degrees, from the corner by the stove to the far wall by the beds. He was burning wood at less than half the rate of his neighbors, a slow, steady consumption that produced a clean, hypnotic hum from the stovepipe. The fire was not hungry. It was content. It was being fed exactly what it needed, a steady diet of pre-warmed air from its own private tunnel. The crisis for Wendell Cosgrave came on the 8th day of the cold snap. He was in his smithy, the great forge roaring, trying to finish a set of hinges. The cold was so intense it had made the thick, oiled leather of his great bellows as brittle as glass. He pulled on the long wooden handle, felt a stiff resistance, and then heard a sickening, tearing sound that echoed in the frigid air. A 6-foot-long split had opened up along the main seam. The bellows exhaled its last breath, and the heart of his fire began to die. Without his forge, he couldn't work. He couldn't heat the smithy, and he couldn't repair the bellows in this cold. The leather would just crack again. He needed a spare, and he remembered with a flash of irritation that the Czech farmer had bought a small one from him in the fall, for some project he never explained. Swearing under his breath, Cosgrave bundled himself in his heaviest coat and walked the 100 yards through the crushing cold to Radek Hrubý's cabin. He walked with his head down, shoulders hunched against the cold that burned his lungs. He knew what to expect when he reached the door. He expected to have to put his shoulder into it, to fight the immense suction created by the stove's draft. His own cabin door was a battle to open, groaning on its hinges as the house took a great gasp of Arctic air. He reached Radek's door and lifted the iron latch, and then the world stopped making sense. The door swung inward silently, weightlessly. It moved with the easy, balanced grace of a door in mid-July. There was no resistance, no inward suck, no groan of protest. He stood on the threshold, confused, his mind struggling to process the absence of a force he had accepted as a constant of winter. The air inside didn't rush out to greet him. It was just still and warm. A gentle, enveloping warmth, not the scorching, dry heat of an overdriven stove. He stepped inside and took in the scene of impossible domestic tranquility. Annetta looked up from her mending and smiled. The children played on the floor. Radek was at the table reading a newspaper. The very air in the room felt different, calm, thick, and peaceful. Cosgrave explained his predicament, his voice a hoarse croak. "My bellows. It split in the cold." "I have the spare," Radek said simply, getting up from the table. "But first, the fire." He walked to the stove. Cosgrave instinctively braced himself, his muscles tensing for the familiar event. In his own home, opening the firebox door was a minor cataclysm. The stove would let out a great whoosh, and the vacuum in the room would intensify for a moment, pulling any loose thing toward the fire's mouth. Papers, stray bits of kindling, dust from the floor, all would leap toward the flames. Radek unlatched the heavy cast-iron door and swung it wide open. Nothing happened. On the edge of the table, not 3 feet from the open maw of the fire, sat a single, loose sheet of paper. It was a page from his daughter's primer, covered in her careful, looping cursive. When the firebox door opened, the page did not stir. It didn't lift at the corner. It didn't tremble. It lay perfectly, impossibly still. Cosgrave stared at the piece of paper. He looked at the calm, glowing heart of the fire, burning with a steady, orange pulse. He looked at the reddish clay pipe that disappeared into the floor behind the stove, And in that moment of profound stillness, the blacksmith, a man of iron and force, finally understood. The fire wasn't breathing the air in the room. He looked at Radek, his face a mask of awe and disbelief. All of his confident pronouncements, his professional certainty, had shattered. "The damp," he managed to say, his voice low. "I told you you'd be breathing creek damp." Radek gave a small, quiet smile. "The earth warms the air, Wendell. It dries it too." Cosgrave shook his head, a slow, wondering motion. He looked around the warm, quiet room, at the comfortable family, at the still piece of paper. He finally grasped the profound reversal of logic that Radek had engineered. "You didn't stop the draft, Radek," he said, his voice filled with the respect of one master craftsman for another. "You gave it a different road to walk." Word of the still piece of paper spread faster than any gossip. It wasn't a story told by Radek, who was not a man given to boasting. It was told by Wendell Cosgrave, and his testimony was unshakable. He told it in the general store, in the churchyard, and to every man who came into his temporarily closed smithy. He described the weightless door and the profound, peaceful warmth inside the Hrubý cabin during the worst freeze in living memory. A blacksmith's word on the nature of fire carried the weight of iron. No one doubted him. The true evidence of the idea's power wasn't in the stories, but in the order books. That spring, as soon as the ground thawed enough for a spade to break it, the first new orders appeared at the regional tile works. The first was from Wendell Cosgrave for a 60-foot run of 4-inch salt-glazed pipe for his own house, and another 100-foot run for his smithy. The next two orders came from blacksmiths in neighboring settlements, men who had heard Cosgrave's story and understood its implications immediately. Men who worked with fire knew the cost of its breath. The innovation spread not as a cabin design, but as a breathing pipe. It traveled along the Mississippi clay belt, from Dubuque to Davenport and beyond. Tile makers began to receive strange orders for their best, vitrified drainage pipe, not for draining fields, but for feeding stoves. The first adopters were always the tradesmen who understood the physics intuitively, blacksmiths, potters, men who ran kilns and forges. From them, it spread to the farmers, who saw the dramatic reduction in their neighbors' wood piles and the unprecedented comfort of their homes. Within 5 years, dozens of homesteads in the region had retrofitted their cabins with the system, forever changing the character of winter on the prairie. What Radek Hrubý accomplished with 90 feet of clay pipe and a deep understanding of the earth was a primitive, passive form of a technology we now consider cutting edge. Modern, high-performance buildings are constructed to be exceptionally airtight to conserve energy, to prevent the indoor air from becoming stale, and to provide combustion air for appliances. They rely on complex mechanical systems called heat recovery ventilators, or make-up air units. These devices use fans and heat exchangers to bring fresh, tempered air into the home, without causing drafts or creating negative pressure. Radek, with materials available to any frontier settler, had engineered a silent geothermal version of the exact same principle, a century before it would be codified by building science. The fire fed from outside burned cleaner than the one fed from the room. This was the central truth of Radek Hrubý's discovery. The principle extended beyond thermodynamics. A home, like a person, cannot sustain its own warmth by consuming itself. To breathe only its own air is to create a vacuum, a desperate, inward-pulling need that invites the harshness of the world in through every unsealed crack and hidden flaw. It is a state of constant, exhausting battle. Radek's genius was in his understanding of boundaries. He made the boundary of his home absolute, sealing it from the uncontrolled invasions of the cold. But he did not isolate it. Instead, he created a single, intentional, and intelligent connection to the world outside. He built a dedicated channel that took only what was necessary, the air for the fire, and transformed it along its journey, turning a destructive force into a source of life. The fire fed from the room was a frantic, needy thing, its hunger creating the very drafts that chilled the space it was meant to warm. But the fire fed by the earth was calm, steady, and self-sufficient. It asked nothing of the room it heated. It allowed life, quiet and warm, to flourish around it. Thank you for joining me on this journey back to the Iowa frontier. If you found the story of Radek Hrubý's Ingenuity as inspiring as I do, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories of forgotten wisdom. What other unseen forces do you think shape our daily lives without us realizing it? Let me know in the comments below. The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes only. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, though the techniques and principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique, historical or modern, should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety standards, and regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.